Sinatra. Tommy, come on, take another bow. Tom Dreesen, ladies and gentlemen. There he is. That's my man. My number one man.
You know, material things didn't mean anything to him, and money meant nothing to him. He was really an advocate of nothing we have is ours. We're only using it. You know, it's everything, that shirt you have on your back, if you die tomorrow, it belongs to somebody else. We were coming out of the Waldorf Astoria in New York one night, going to do a show. And we had to go out the back way, because if you went out the front way, Frank would get mobbed, you know. So as we were going out, a woman jumped out of the doorway to try to get Frank's autograph. And the doorman told me later she'd been hiding there for 5 hours. And so the security was rushing us to the limousine, and the woman started hollering, "Mr. Sinatra, Mr. Sinatra, please, Mr. Sinatra." And they held her back as Frank was getting in the limo, but she kept hollering, "Mr. Sinatra, please, please." He stopped and he walked back and told the security, let her go. He said, "What is it?" She said, "Would you please sign an autograph to my husband? He's home very, very ill, and this would mean the world to him." He said, "Sure." He's signing the autograph, and she said, "Oh, what beautiful cufflinks. They're very expensive cufflinks. I know where he got them at." And he said, "Thank you." And when he finished the autograph, he took his cufflinks off and he handed to her. He said, "Give these to your husband." She said, No, I don't want them. I was just admiring them." He said, "No, I want your husband to have them." And so we get in the limo. I said, "Frank, that was beautiful. But why'd you do that?" He said, "Tommy, if you possess something that you can't give away, then you don't possess it. It possesses you." I said, "Wow, that was pretty profound." And then he elaborated more. He said, "Tommy, nothing we have is ours. That shirt on your back," he said, "if you die tomorrow, someone else will be wearing that shirt somewhere down the line." He said, Aristotle Onassis, very wealthy man, had billions of dollars, had mansions, private jets, private yachts. The second he died, it all transferred. We're only using it. Nothing we have is ours. And he not only talked that talk, he walked that talk. One of the things you have to learn if you were a friend of Frank Sinatra is to be very careful around him, not to mention that you wanted something or needed something, because he'd try to make it happy. You know, you couldn't say to him, "Gee, that's a beautiful watch." He'd take it off and give it to you. You know, you couldn't say, "What a beautiful painting." He'd take it off the wall and hand it to you. So his friends knew not to do that, you know, to him. And Frank did not want people to know about a lot of things that he did. Sometimes you do a charity, there's a lot of publicity, you can't hide from it. But if he could do something privately and quietly without the other person knowing it, that's the way he wanted it done. There's things he's done that no one will ever know. But if he saw in the paper somewhere that someone was in desperate need of some kind of finances because of an illness in the family or a terrible accident or some catastrophe, his secretary was Dorothy Allman, and she'd do a little research, find out where these people were, and someone would deliver a check to that person anonymously, you know, because he didn't want anybody to know that. The other thing you had to learn about Frank Sinatra, if you were going to travel with him or have anything to do with him, never late, ever late for any appointment. This is the great Frank Sinatra, no prima donna about him. You know, when I see stars today make people wait 45 minutes, wait for an hour, I think you aren't bigger than Frank was, and he never made anybody wait. He was always on time, and he wanted you to be on time. If he told you the jet's leaving, wheels up at 9 o'clock, and you showed up at 9:01, you were watching the plane go down the runway. So you better be on time. He said, "Tommy, if somebody tells you to be in their office at 9:30 in the morning and you show up at 9:45, you just told them that your time is far more important than their time. And no one's that big, Tommy. No one's that important." I said to Frank the one time, I said, "Why do we wear tuxedos?" He said, "Tommy, if we were going to do a show for the King and the Queen tomorrow, would we wear a tuxedo?" I said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Well, that garage mechanic in Detroit and his waitress wife who work all year long to afford 2 tickets to our show, they're just as much royalty as the King and the Queen, and they need to be treated exactly that way." I have old school manners. I was taught as a boy growing up, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir, no, sir. That if a guy was 2, 3 years older than me, I called him Mr. You know, I had these old school manners. When I got to know Frank Sinatra, he had really old school manners. He surprised me. If we were out to dinner and there were like 4 or 5 women, 4 or 5 guys, and they were sitting around talking after dinner, and over here, a woman would get up to go use the restroom. Frank would rise because she rose, and then he'd sit down and he'd keep talking to you. And when she returned from the restroom and sat down, he'd rise again till she sat down. That's really old school manners. And the other thing that I really respected him for, when guys got together, as guys do, at some point in the evening, some of them would start talking about their sexual exploitations, the things they did, and so forth and so on. And Frank dated some of the most beautiful women in the world. And so sooner or later, somebody would get around to Frank and say, Frank, hey, tell us about you and Marilyn Monroe, or you and somebody like that, Ava Gardner. And he would never, ever comment on anything like that. He'd always say, that's none of your business. It's none of your business. But I never heard him ever talk about someone was great in bed or somebody did something extraordinary. He just wasn't that kind of guy. He really had old school manners. One of the things that I didn't know about Frank Sinatra when I first met him was that he was the world's worst driver. And the first time I stayed in his home, he's got a beautiful compound down in Rancho Mirage on Frank Sinatra Drive. Once you get inside the compound, there's the main house where Frank, of course, stayed, Frank and Barbara, and there's a swimming pool and the tennis courts and all that kind of stuff. But on the outer perimeters are all these bungalows, and they're named after his songs, New York, New York, Strangers in the Night, Tender Trap, My Way. And so he had a compound full of house guests, and when I got down there, the moment I arrived, I went to my bungalow and I unpacked my clothes, and I go to a cocktail party and I look and, oh my God, there's Gregory Peck and his wife Veronique. There's Kirk Douglas and his wife Ann. There's Jack Lemmon and his wife Felicia. There's Robert Wagner and Joe St. John. And Alan Shepard, the first man in space, and on the 5th lunar mission landed on the moon. And I'm an ex-Navy man. This is an admiral, and I'm just in awe. And I'm in the corner just looking at all these people that I had seen in movies when I was growing up, But also, the ambassador from Italy was there with his wife. So, no, they had a nice cocktail party and everything. And the next morning at brunch, with all these stars there that all knew Frank for years and years, and all these people, Frank makes the announcement, I'm going to take the ambassador from Italy and his wife to the airport. Who wants to ride with me? And in a second, the room was empty. I looked around and I said, Frank, I'll ride. He said, come on, Tommy. We go outside. He had a lot of cars, but he had a station wagon that Lee Iacocca had given him. He said, Tommy, get in the back with the ambassador's wife, and the ambassador sit up front with Frank. I get in the back, and the woman from Italy, she gets in the back, she nods at me, and I nod at her. We go to the security gate of his compound, and the security guard's job is to come outside, open the gate, walk out onto Frank Sinatra Drive and look both ways, and then wave you out to make sure there's no traffic coming. Security guard opened the gate, he took one step, and Frank went, boom, shot out onto the street. Now cars are going, She looks at me, and I look at her, and I never had written with him before. Now, everywhere he went, every stop sign he came to, if this was a stop sign, he'd be a quarter of the way into the intersection, By the 3rd stoplight, she's got the rosary out. The old ladies from Italy, she's saying the rosary, By the 4th stoplight, I realized why everybody emptied that room when he said, who wants to ride with me to the airport, And he drove like crazy to the airport. Finally dropped the ambassador and his wife off at the airport on a private jet. We go out onto the tarmac, and she gets out of the car, and I get out of the car. She says to me, do you have to ride back with a hymn? And I said, yes. And she took her thumb and made the sign of the cross on my forehead, On the way back, he's doing the same thing. He's talking to me, and he's talking to, when Frank wanted to go from the right lane to the left lane, he went, directionals, that's for other people. Arm out the window, go this lane. He just went wherever he wanted to go. So he's going along. He's on the outside lane, and he cuts over to the left, and he cut a guy off, and the guy almost went up on that island structure like they have down in Palm Springs, up in the center divide. So the guy, and Frank's still talking, and I think, oh my God, he cut that guy off. Now, the guy backs up, and he's chasing us. He finally pulls alongside of us. Frank is still oblivious to this. And the guy's stood at me, you son of a bitch. And he's cursing at me. I went, "Good." He's driving, And the guy's driving. He goes, "Sinatra." Frank Sinatra. Yeah, he goes, yeah. I knew he wants to go home and say to his wife, honey, you don't know who damn near killed me today. Frank Sinatra, We get back to the compound and all the celebrities were there. Robert Wagner said to me, "Did you enjoy your little trip?" I said, "You aren't going to believe RJ." He said, We know. He just was, and I heard he was a terrible driver at age 21. So you can imagine at age 65 what a bad driver he was. And then finally years went by and Barbara said to him one day, "Frank, you can't drive anymore." Frank Sinatra was not the easiest guy in the world to be a friend of because he was very cautious in later years of friendships, certainly of the media. He was always very worried about them because anything you say around them, it spreads out, So he'd come and get me out of my bungalow sometimes and say, "Tommy, let's take a ride." Because he stayed up till dawn. He was nocturnal. We'd talk all during the whole time there, about him growing up in Hoboken and me growing up on the south side of Chicago and so many things we had in common. But riding around with him, when I was alone with him, he wasn't the great Frank Sinatra, and I wasn't this comedian Tom Dreesen. He was a kid from Hoboken, and I was a kid from Harvey, Illinois, on the south side of Chicago. And we would talk about that sometimes. He grew up in saloons. His mom and dad owned a bar called Marty O'Brien's Bar and Grill because in those days, his father boxed under the name of Marty O'Brien. There was so much prejudice against Italians in those days. There were large lynchings in America on Italians in the 1890s, and one of the largest lynchings of all was down in Huntsville, Louisiana, I believe. And they actually burned out a whole village in Pennsylvania of Italians, So there was a lot of prejudice against Italians. And so the Italian guys would change their names to Irish names when they boxed. Thus, his father boxed under the name of Marty O'Brien and had some local popularity, so they later opened up a tavern called Marty O'Brien's Bar and Grill. And Frank's mother ran the tavern. She was a Democratic precinct captain also in Hoboken, and a tough lady. But anyhow, so Frank, when he was a little boy, the sailors would come in there and they had a piano Nickelodeon where you put a nickel in and you press the button and a song would come on, the piano would play by itself. And Frank would sing a song by the piano and they'd give him a nickel, He used to tell me that story. So he grew up in a saloon, and my mother was a bartender, and I shined shoes in taverns, so I grew up in saloons. So, he always said to the public, he said, "I'm a saloon singer." That's what he called himself, a saloon singer, a guy who sang about, women who leave you, and you're sitting in a bar at 3 o'clock in the morning. So he always called himself a saloon singer. And New York Times guy one time said to Frank, "How come you keep Tom Dreesen with you all the time?" He said, "You mean besides the fact that he's funny?" And Frank said, "Yeah." The reporter said, "Yeah, besides the fact he's funny." Frank said, "Well, if I'm a saloon singer, then Tommy's a saloon comedian. By that I mean, we're just a couple of neighborhood guys." And I've always treasured that comment because when I got alone in the car with him, that's what we were. We were a couple of neighborhood guys. With Frank Sinatra, there were many words that describe him, but the one thing you learned as a friend of Frank Sinatra's, one word that stuck in my mind always was loyalty. He was so loyal. I did a pilot in Chicago many years ago called Dreesen Street. It was going to be me behind a bar because I was a former bartender, but my guests would come into the bar. It was a talk show. So for the pilot, I got Johnny Bench, and I asked Frank to do it, and Frank did it. He did my pilot, And afterward, I couldn't stop thanking him. I said, "Frank, thank you very much." He said, "Tommy, stop it." I said, "Yeah, but, for you to do this, as busy a man as you are." He said, "Tommy, we do these shows for strangers all the time. Why wouldn't we do them for friends?" That's what I'll treasure all my life, to have that kind of a relationship with him meant the world to me. Yeah. And the other thing, too, that I think typified my friendship with him and how much that he liked me and I liked him. In Chicago one time, we were at Gibson's Steakhouse. So we'd finished a show at Chicago Theater. We went to Gibson's for dinner. And while I was there, we were sitting at a table, a couple walked by the table and said to me, Mr. Dreesen, we run in your run every year for multiple sclerosis. And Frank said, I said, well, thank you very much. After that, Frank said, what's that all about? I said, well, every year I run 26 miles for MS. My sister Darlene had MS, so I called it 26 miles for Darlene, and people pledge money for every mile I run. And I said, a lot of celebrities come in and they run with me. You know, guys, Frank knew Frankie Valli, Frankie Avalon, Tony Danza, Smokey Robinson, Eddie Marinaro. I mean, I'm leaving out, the Chicago Bears, the Chicago Cubs, they all came and participated. They'd run a block or 2 blocks or maybe a mile. Smokey Robinson's the only one who ran all 26 miles with me. But I said to Frank, Frank, why don't you come? Maybe you can run. He said, are you kidding me? He said, I couldn't walk 26 steps, 26 miles. He said, I ride a stationary bike. And he started doodling something on a napkin. He said, it was his idea. We set up a camera crew at WLS TV in Chicago, ABC TV Chicago, set up a camera crew, and Frank was riding a stationary bike promoting my 26-mile run.
Hi, this is Tom Dreesen. Each year Tom and celebrity friends run 26 miles to raise money for multiple sclerosis.
This year, lots of great people will be joining me, like Frankie Avalon, Smokey Robinson, Robert Conrad, Boom Boom Mancini, Connie Stevens.
So join Tom in Chicago's southwest suburbs on Sunday, July 1, and run for MS.
Sally Struzzles will be there, Tony Danza, Betty Thomas, Johnny Yoon, Frankie Valli, they'll all be there. We really need your help because we're going to keep on running until there is no multiple sclerosis any longer. Frank, are you going to run?
You kidding? I can hardly run this thing.
But that again shows you the kind of relationship I had with him. I never met Frank Sinatra's mom, Dolly, but he talked about her a few times, when I was with him on the flights coming back from a gig or sitting around the house. He told me a story that actually was in the newspaper. He had a clipping of it. A guy knocked on the door and he had a little child with him. And he said, my car broke down. Could I use your phone? I need to call for help. And she let the guy in, and he pulled a knife on her. And he said to her, he wanted her money. She said, please don't hurt me. Please don't hurt me. I'm an old woman. Please don't hurt me. I'll give you all the money. And she went in the drawer, and she had a blackjack in there. And she cracked him over the head, and he drops to the floor. Now, the little boy starts crying, you've hit my dad. She said, your dad's a bad man. He was going to rob me. I'm an old lady, And Frank was telling this story. She's trying to console the little boy. It'll be all right. The guy starts waking up. She whacked him again. Now, Frank said when the cops came, she was sitting on top of the guy, And he had a newspaper clipping of that. Interesting story. So I would like to have met her. His mom was far more vocal. He said his dad was very quiet, kind of a quiet guy. And his dad really didn't want him to go into show business. His dad, like most Italian fathers, would say, learn a trade, get a job, But he felt like his dad wasn't encouraging him certainly as much as his mom. And years later, he told me this story about that. I think maybe it was after his dad died or something, but he went to the door and his dad's belongings. His dad had all the clippings of Frank when he was young. And it kind of choked him up because he realized his dad really did care about him, He was very politically astute. He loved FDR. He claims he named his son Franklin after FDR, He loved FDR. He campaigned for Humphreys. He also campaigned for Ronald Reagan. He saw both sides, And he did so much for civil rights. And the song, The House I Live In, really exemplifies that. What is America to me? And every night when Frank Sinatra would sing that song in concert in 20,000-seat arenas, in Hawaii in a 40,000-seat arena, I had to be out there to watch because it would give me chills to watch him sing that song. So when he got to the part about what is America to me, and he'd sing all the things, his high school, the house, the playgrounds, and blah, blah. When he got to the part, but especially the people, Hank Catania, his road manager, would have all the lights come on in the arena. He'd go, the people, the people, the people. And it would give me chills. People would stand and cheer and cheer and cheer. Because, Frank was so much about patriotism and so much about that America is a great country and had its faults. But there were people rectifying those faults. And he was one of them. I toured with Sammy Davis Jr. for 3 years before I ever met Frank. Sammy told me this story, and it's been in books and everything, but that Frank went down to Harlem to catch the Will Maston Trio because he heard so much about him. Frank went down to see him because he heard about this Will Maston Trio. He saw him down in Harlem and loved it. He went backstage and he told Sammy how much he loved what he did. Sammy was overwhelmed. Frank Sinatra came down to Harlem to see his show. He said, I want you to come and see my show. Frank was appearing in the theater at that time. And he said, I want you to come and be my guest. And Sammy said, sure. A week went by, and Frank went back to Harlem to watch the Will Maston Trio again. This time he went backstage and he said to Sammy, I'm mad at you. I've seen your show twice now. You've never come to see my show at all. He said, I did come, Frank. They wouldn't let me in. Frank said, they wouldn't let you in. And Sammy tells a story. Frank went back to the theater, got the manager, ripped his contract up and threw it in his face and walked off that gig. And he needed that gig, But, the same way in Vegas, Quincy Jones tells the stories, Sammy tells the stories, that when the black people, in those days they called them colored, but in those days when they'd go to work in a casino, Louis Armstrong or Count Basie, they could work in the showroom, but they had to live in what Sammy called it color town. They couldn't stay in the same hotel. And Frank said, if Sammy can't stay there, then I can't stay there. And that put that to a halt, He was also that way with charity. He couldn't stand to see pain in other human beings, especially children. That's why he was so endeared to the Barbara Sinatra Children's Center that treated physically, emotionally, and sexually abused children. And Frank, he'd have to walk away sometimes because he couldn't stand the thought of a child being injured or hurt emotionally, physically, or sexually, So, he was very sensitive about those kind of things.
Tommy's funny, isn't he? He's a marvelous guy, Tommy is. He's a funny man and a nice man. Where is he? Take a bow, pal.
At first he was the boss of this magnificent tour, and then he became a friend. We became buddies. We started hanging out together and taking places. But toward the end of his life, he became like a father to me. He'd give me advice. He gave me advice when I was going through my divorce. He gave me advice, on so many different matters, on show business matters. I didn't have that kind of father, and I always wanted that kind of father, By the way, another thing I'd say to him if he was here, you have no idea how much the world misses you.